The gunshot echoed across the dusty street of Redemption Creek, Arizona Territory, 1878, as Grace Valenti clutched the torn telegram in her trembling fingers. The news of her father's death had come with a cruel addendum: he had gambled away everything, including her. According to the dusty paper in her hands, she now belonged to Henry Blackwood, the most feared man in the territory, who intended to teach her a lesson about her father's debts by selling her to the highest bidder. Grace stared at the approaching men with defiance burning in her hazel eyes. At 22, she had grown accustomed to her father's reckless ways, but never imagined he would barter with her life. She smoothed her simple blue dress, one of the few possessions she had managed to keep, and stood tall despite the fear coursing through her veins. "Time to go, Miss Valenti," growled one of Blackwood's henchmen, reaching for her arm with calloused fingers. "Take your hands off me," Grace snapped, pulling away. "I am not merchandise to be traded." The man laughed, a harsh sound that scraped against the morning air. "Your father didn't seem to think so when he put you up as collateral. Now move." Before Grace could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted the tense standoff. A cloud of dust announced the arrival of a lone rider on a magnificent chestnut stallion. The man dismounted with fluid grace, his movements betraying years of experience in the saddle. Tall and broad-shouldered, he cut an imposing figure against the rising sun, his face partially obscured by the shadow of his worn Stetson. "Is there a problem here?" The newcomer's voice was deep and steady, carrying the quiet authority of a man unaccustomed to being questioned. "None of your concern, Drifter," the henchman spat. "This is business between Miss Valenti and Mr. Blackwood." The stranger pushed his hat back, revealing piercing blue eyes set in a sun-weathered face. He couldn't have been more than 30, but his eyes held the weight of someone who had seen far more than his years suggested. "I believe the lady doesn't wish to go with you," he said, his hand casually resting near the revolver at his hip. "Who the hell do you think you are?" The henchman's hand moved toward his own weapon. "The name's Jackson Dawson. Most folks call me Jack." He stepped forward, positioning himself between Grace and her would-be captors. "And I don't take kindly to men forcing unwilling women anywhere." The name sent a ripple of unease through the group. Even Grace recognized it. Jack Dawson was known throughout the territory as one of the fastest guns in the West, though rumors suggested he'd hung up his gun-slinging days to ranch somewhere in the Northern Territories. "Dawson," the second henchman swallowed hard. "Look, we're just following orders." The girl's father lost her fair and square in a poker game. Jack's expression hardened. "A man can't gamble away another human being, not even his own daughter. That's not how the law works, even out here." "Mr. Blackwood won't like this interference," the first man warned, though he had backed up a step. "Mr. Blackwood is welcome to discuss it with me personally." Jack's voice remained calm, but the steel beneath was unmistakable. "Now I suggest you boys head back and explain that Miss Valenti is under my protection now." For a tense moment, Grace thought they might draw on him. Instead, the men exchanged nervous glances before the leader spat in the dust. "This ain't over, Dawson. Blackwood doesn't forget." "Neither do I," Jack replied evenly. The men retreated to their horses, casting dark glances over their shoulders as they rode away. Only when they had disappeared from sight did Jack turn to face Grace. "Are you hurt, Miss Valenti?" Grace found her voice, which had abandoned her during the confrontation. "No, thank you, Mr. Dawson, but I'm afraid you've made a powerful enemy on my behalf." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Henry Blackwood and I have unfinished business already. This just adds another chapter." He glanced around the nearly empty street. Do you have somewhere safe to stay? Grace shook her head, the reality of her situation crashing down upon her. No, my father's debts. Everything is gone. The house, the store, everything. Jack considered this for a moment, then made a decision that would change both their lives forever. I have a ranch about a day's ride north of here. I need someone to help with the household cooking, cleaning, that sort of thing. It would be honest work with fair pay and a roof over your head. Grace studied him suspiciously. Why would you help me? You don't even know me. Let's just say I know what it's like to be at someone else's mercy, Jack replied, his eyes briefly clouding with a memory before clearing again. Besides, I could use the help, and you need a place where Blackwood can't reach you easily. Grace weighed her options, which were painfully few. She could try to run, but with no money and no connections, how far would she get? The town had already turned its back on her, not wanting to cross Blackwood. This stranger was offering her safety and employment, though experience had taught her that men rarely gave without expecting something in return. I'll be clear, Mr. Dawson. I'll work for my keep, but if you're expecting other arrangements, I'll take my chances with Blackwood. Jack's expression remained impassive, but something like respect flickered in his eyes. I'm offering you a job, Miss Valenti, nothing more. You'll have your own quarters, your own privacy, and your wages will be your own. I give you my word. There was something in his steady gaze that Grace found herself trusting despite her better judgment. She nodded slowly. Then I accept your offer, Mr. Dawson. Good. He gestured to his horse. Gather whatever you can carry. We should leave before Blackwood gets word and decides to come himself. Within the hour, Grace had collected her meager possessions, a few clothes, her mother's silver hairbrush, a worn family Bible, and a small portrait of her parents from happier times. She tied her belongings into a bundle and met Jack outside the boarding house where she'd been staying. He helped her mount the chestnut stallion before swinging up behind her, keeping a respectful distance despite the closeness the saddle forced upon them. Hold on, he instructed as they set off, leaving Redemption Creek and its dusty promises behind. As they rode, the landscape gradually transformed from the parched flats surrounding the town to rolling hills dotted with juniper and pine. Grace found herself studying her rescuer's profile when she thought he wouldn't notice. There was a hardness to his jaw that spoke of determination, but the lines around his eyes hinted at a man who had once laughed easily. "How did you come to be in Redemption Creek?" she asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. Jack was quiet for so long that Grace wondered if he'd heard her. Finally, he answered, "I had business with the bank, selling some cattle." "And instead you bought yourself trouble," Grace said softly. A low chuckle rumbled through his chest. "Trouble seems to find me regardless of what I do, Miss Valenti. Please call me Grace." "Grace," he repeated, as if testing the name. "It suits you." They stopped to rest at midday by a small creek where Jack produced jerky and hard tack from his saddlebags. As they ate, Grace couldn't help but notice how alert he remained, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. "You don't think Blackwood would follow us, do you?" she asked, suddenly anxious. "I don't think I know," Jack replied matter-of-factly. "Henry Blackwood doesn't like losing, and he especially doesn't like being publicly challenged. But we've got a good head start, and once we reach the ranch, we'll be better positioned to deal with whatever comes." "You speak as if you know him well." A shadow crossed Jack's face. "We have history." "None of it good." Grace wanted to ask more, but something in his expression warned her not to press. Instead, she changed the subject. "Tell me about your ranch." His features softened slightly. 500 acres of the most beautiful country you've ever seen. Good water, good grass. I run about 300 head of cattle, some of the best stock in the territory. And you manage it all alone. I have a foreman, Miguel, and a couple of hands. But the house—" he hesitated. "It's been empty since my sister married and moved east last year. She used to keep things in order." "And now that task falls to me," Grace said, understanding dawning. Jack nodded. The place could use a woman's touch again. They continued their journey as the afternoon sun began its slow descent behind the western mountains. Jack pointed out landmarks and shared stories of the land. They passed through how the creek to their east had once been the site of a short-lived gold rush, how the strangely shaped rock formation ahead marked the boundary of what had once been Apache territory. As dusk approached, they crested a hill and Jack reined in the horse. Below them stretched a verdant valley, cradled by gentle slopes covered in pines. A substantial log ranch house stood in the center, surrounded by several outbuildings, corrals, and fenced pastures where cattle grazed. "Welcome to the Lazy D," Jack said, a note of pride in his voice. Grace caught her breath at the beauty of it. After the dust and desperation of Redemption Creek, the ranch seemed like something from a dream, peaceful, prosperous, protected. They rode down into the valley as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. A Mexican man emerged from the barn as they approached, raising a hand in greeting. "That's Miguel," Jack explained. "Been with me since I bought this place 5 years ago. His wife, Elena, comes up from their cabin to cook dinner for us sometimes, but mostly the men fend for themselves." "Until now," Grace said with determination. If she was to make a place for herself here, she would earn her keep. Miguel helped Grace down from the horse, his weathered face creasing into a smile as Jack explained her presence. "The house will be glad for a woman's care again, Señorita," he said warmly. "It has been too quiet since Miss Rebecca left." Jack led Grace to the main house, a substantial 2-story structure built of thick logs and local stone. Inside, it was larger than it appeared from outside, with a great room dominated by a massive stone fireplace, a dining area that could seat a dozen, and a well-appointed kitchen with an iron cookstove that made Grace's fingers itch to try it. "It's beautiful," she said honestly, taking in the solid craftsmanship. The furnishings were simple but of good quality, though she could see that dust had gathered in corners and the floors could use a good scrubbing. "Rebecca's room is upstairs, first door on the right," Jack said, gesturing to the staircase. "It's yours now. I'm across the hall. The hands sleep in the bunkhouse out back, and I take my meals with them most days, but now I'm here to cook," Grace finished for him, smiling slightly. "I don't mind. I enjoy cooking when I have proper ingredients to work with." A hint of relief crossed Jack's features. "I'll have Miguel's wife show you where everything is stored tomorrow. For tonight, there should be some beans and bacon we can heat up." After a simple meal that Grace insisted on preparing despite her exhaustion, Jack showed her to Rebecca's room. It was spacious and feminine, with a large bed covered in a patchwork quilt, a cedar wardrobe, and a washstand with a porcelain basin. "My sister left some clothes behind," Jack said, opening the wardrobe to reveal several dresses. "They might need taking in, but they'll do until we can get into town for supplies." Grace ran her fingers over a calico dress, overwhelmed by his thoughtfulness. "Thank you, Mr. Dawson, Jack," he corrected her. "If I'm calling you Grace, it's only fair." "Jack," she amended, "thank you for everything. I don't know how I'll ever repay this kindness." He shook his head. "No repayment necessary, just do your job and we'll call it square." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Get some rest. Tomorrow will be a busy day." After he left, Grace sat on the edge of the bed, scarcely able to believe the turn her life had taken in the span of a single day. That morning, she had been facing a future as Blackwood's property, to be sold to whoever would pay his price. Tonight, She was safe in a beautiful home with honest work ahead of her. Yet as she prepared for bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that this respite might be temporary. Jack had made an enemy of Henry Blackwood for her sake, and she'd seen enough of the world to know that men like Blackwood didn't forgive or forget. With that uneasy thought, she blew out the lamp and slipped beneath the quilt, falling into an exhausted sleep before she could worry further. Grace awakened to sunshine streaming through lace curtains and the unfamiliar sounds of a working ranch filtering through her open window. For a moment, she was disoriented, then the events of the previous day rushed back. She rose quickly, washing her face in the basin before selecting the simplest of Rebecca's dresses, a sky blue cotton with a modest neckline and practical cut. It was slightly loose in the bodice but otherwise fit well enough. She braided her long, dark hair and pinned it up before heading downstairs, determined to begin earning her keep immediately. The kitchen was empty, but the back door stood open, letting in the fresh morning air. Outside, she found Jack splitting wood, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal muscular forearms as he brought the axe down with practiced precision. He paused when he saw her, wiping sweat from his brow with a kerchief. "You're up early," he observed. "Sleep well." "Better than I expected," Grace admitted. "I thought I should start breakfast. Are the hands up yet?" Jack nodded. "They've been up since dawn, tending to the stock. They'll be hungry when they come in." He gestured toward a path leading down the hill. "That trail leads to Miguel and Alina's cabin. Alina will be up shortly to show you around." As if summoned by his words, a plump, middle-aged Mexican woman appeared on the path, carrying a basket covered with a cloth. She smiled broadly when she saw Grace. "Buenos dias. You must be Miss Grace. Miguel told me of your arrival." She handed the basket to Grace. "Fresh eggs from my hens and some sourdough starter for bread. I am Alina." Grace took the basket gratefully. "Thank you, Alina. I was just about to start breakfast." "I will help you learn the kitchen," Alina offered. "Senor Jack, you go finish your work. We women will handle the food." Jack touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect before returning to his wood splitting. Grace followed Alina into the kitchen, where the older woman quickly showed her where everything was kept: the flour bin, the salt box, the smoked meats hanging in the pantry, the root cellar accessed through a trapdoor in the floor. "Senor Jack, he is a good man," Alina said as they worked side by side, preparing a hearty breakfast of flapjacks, eggs, and bacon. "He works hard, expects the same from others, but treats everyone fair." "How did he come to own this ranch?" Grace asked, curious about the man who had saved her from such a grim fate. Alina measured coffee grounds into the large pot. "He won it in a card game, they say, from a man who did not care for it properly. That was 5 years ago. The ranch was nothing then: broken fences, poor cattle, the house nearly falling down. Senor Jack, he built it all up again." Grace was impressed. It couldn't have been easy to transform a neglected property into the prosperous operation she now saw. His sister lived with him until recently. She, Miss Rebecca. A good girl, but lonely here. She married a businessman from St. Louis last year. Alina lowered her voice conspiratorially. "The house has been too quiet since she left. Senor Jack, he does not say so, but I think he has been lonely too." Before Grace could respond to this intriguing observation, the back door opened, and several dusty cowboys filed in, led by Jack. They removed their hats respectfully when they saw Grace, mumbling shy greetings as Jack introduced them: Miguel, whom she'd met briefly the night before; Pedro, a young Mexican vaquero with a dazzling smile; and Hank, an older man with a grizzled beard and kind eyes. "Smells mighty fine, Miss Grace," Hank said appreciatively as they sat at the large table. "Been a while since we had proper cooking around here." Grace served the food, pleased by their obvious enjoyment. Jack ate quickly, but with evident appreciation, complimenting her on the flapjacks before outlining the day's work to his men. They were in the midst of spring calving, he explained, and every hand was needed to check the herds scattered across the ranch's pastures. "I'll be up at the north section today," he told Grace as the men filed out after breakfast. "Won't be back until supper." "I'll have something ready," she promised, already mentally inventorying the pantry, "and I'll start on the house cleaning." He nodded approvingly. "Take your time getting settled. There's no rush." After Jack and the men left, Grace tackled the house with determined energy. She began in the kitchen, scrubbing every surface until it gleamed, then moved to the great room, sweeping and dusting, polishing the few pieces of silver she found, and arranging wildflowers in a pottery jug to brighten the mantel. As she worked, she found herself wondering more about Jack Dawson. The house contained few personal touches, a bookshelf filled with volumes ranging from practical manuals on cattle breeding to classic literature, a fine chess set positioned near the fireplace, a guitar hanging on the wall that looked well used. Each item hinted at a complexity that belied his quiet, reserved demeanor. By mid-afternoon, Grace had worked her way upstairs. She changed the linens on Jack's bed and swept his room, careful not to disturb his personal belongings. A framed photograph on his dresser caught her attention, a younger Jack standing beside a pretty young woman who shared his blue eyes. Rebecca, she presumed. They were both smiling, though even then there was a seriousness about Jack that the camera had captured. She continued cleaning, finding a study at the end of the hall filled with ledgers and maps. It was here she discovered a locked drawer in the desk, the only secured space she'd encountered in the entire house. Curious, but respectful of his privacy, she dusted around it and moved on. The sun was beginning to set when Grace heard horses approaching. She hurried downstairs to check on the stew she had simmering and to put the cornbread she'd prepared into the oven. Through the window, she saw Jack dismounting, his movements betraying exhaustion after a long day in the saddle. When he entered the kitchen, the rich aroma of beef stew and baking bread greeted him. He stopped short, inhaling deeply before a smile transformed his weary features. "That smells like heaven," he said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "Wash up, and it'll be ready by the time you're done," Grace instructed, surprising herself with how quickly she'd adapted to running his household. Jack disappeared to the washroom off the back porch, returning with his hair damp and his face clean-shaven. They sat at the kitchen table together, Grace having learned from Alina that the men preferred to eat at the bunkhouse in the evenings unless specifically invited to the main house. "This is delicious," Jack said after his first bite of stew. "It's been a long time since I've had home cooking like this." "I'm glad you approve," Grace said, pleased by the compliment. "I found your garden still has some early vegetables coming up, though it needs attention. Alina showed me the root cellar and you're well stocked with preserves." Jack nodded. "Rebecca was good at planning ahead. We'll need to go into town soon, though, to replenish supplies and get you anything you need." The mention of town made Grace tense. "Is that wise? Blackwood, we can't hide forever," Jack said pragmatically. "Besides, the nearest town is Winston, not Redemption Creek. It's smaller, but they have a general store and a bank. Blackwood has less influence there, though he's still known." "You seem very familiar with his reach," Grace observed, studying him over her bowl. Jack's expression closed slightly. "I make it my business to know who holds power in the territory." He changed the subject. "The house looks better already. You've been busy." Grace accepted the deflection. "I like having something useful to do. Tomorrow I'll tackle the laundry and see what can be done about that vegetable garden." They ate in companionable silence for a while before Jack spoke again. "I should warn you we might have company soon. The circuit judge passes through Winston every few months, and he often stays here when he's in the area. Judge Parker is an old friend. When do you expect him? Any time now." His letter said early May, and it's the 3rd already. Jack pushed his empty bowl aside. "He might be able to help with your situation legally, I mean. Invalidate whatever claim Blackwood thinks he has on you." Hope flared in Grace's chest. "Do you think that's possible?" Jack's blue eyes met hers steadily. "I don't know, but Parker's a fair man and knows the law better than anyone in the territory. If anyone can help, it's him." The next week fell into a comfortable routine. Grace rose early each morning to prepare breakfast for Jack and the hands, spent her days cleaning, cooking, and gradually bringing order to the neglected garden, then prepared supper in the evenings. Sometimes Jack ate with the men. Other nights, he joined her at the kitchen table, where their conversations gradually became more relaxed and wide-ranging. She learned that he had grown up in Texas, the son of a rancher who had lost everything during the Civil War. He had made his own way from a young age, working cattle drives, trying his hand at prospecting, even riding as a deputy marshal for a time before winning the ranch. He spoke little of those years, but Grace sensed they had been hard ones. For his part, Jack discovered that Grace was the daughter of an Italian immigrant who had married a schoolteacher from Boston. Her mother had died of fever when Grace was 16, leaving her to care for her father, whose gambling and drinking had intensified after his wife's death. Despite her circumstances, Grace had educated herself by reading voraciously and possessed a quick mind that Jack clearly respected. On the 8th day after her arrival, Grace was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard riders approaching. Shading her eyes against the morning sun, she made out 3 men on horseback coming up the main trail to the ranch. One rode a distinctive black stallion and wore clothing finer than the typical rancher or cowhand, a tailored black coat despite the warming weather, a silk vest, and a flat-brimmed black hat. Something about the lead rider's posture sent a chill through Grace even before she could make out his features. She abandoned the laundry and hurried toward the barn, where she knew Jack was repairing tack. "Jack," she called as she entered the cool darkness of the barn. "Riders coming, 3 of them." He looked up from his work, immediately alert. "Blackwood?" "I think so," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "The man in front matches the descriptions I've heard." Jack put down his tools and moved to the barn door, peering out at the approaching riders. His face hardened as he confirmed Grace's suspicion. "Stay behind me," he instructed, his hand moving to check the revolver at his hip. "Let me do the talking." They walked out to the yard together, Jack's posture relaxed but watchful as the riders drew rein before them. Henry Blackwood was a striking man in his 40s, with silver-streaked dark hair and cold gray eyes that assessed everything as if determining its value. The 2 men flanking him were clearly hired guns, their expressions wary as they took in Jack's stance. "Dawson," Blackwood greeted him with a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's been a while." "Not long enough, Henry," Jack replied evenly. "What brings you to my property?" Blackwood's gaze shifted to Grace, who fought the urge to shrink back from his appraising stare. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." His voice was cultured, betraying Eastern origins despite his years in the West. "People can't belong to other people," Jack said, his tone hardening. "Not even when their fathers are fool enough to wager them in a card game." "A debt is a debt, Dawson. You of all people should understand that." Blackwood's smile took on a dangerous edge. "Marco Valenti owed me $5,000. His daughter was collateral." Then you should have collected from Marco, not tried to sell his daughter. Jack's voice remained calm, but Grace could sense the anger beneath his words. Marco Valenti died owing me, Blackwood said dismissively. The girl is the only asset left. She's not an asset. She's a free woman working for honest wages. Jack shifted slightly, putting himself more firmly between Grace and the mounted men. I suggest you accept your loss and ride out. Blackwood's expression hardened. You're making a mistake, Dawson. I don't forget when people interfere with my business. Neither do I forget when men treat women like property, Jack countered. Now, I've been civil so far, Henry, but my hospitality only stretches so far. State your business clearly or leave. For a tense moment, Grace thought Blackwood might order his men to attack. Instead, he let out a short laugh. Always the gentleman outlaw, aren't you, Dawson? Very well, I'll be direct. I want $5,000 the debt owed me or the girl comes with me. Not happening, Jack said flatly. The debt died with her father. And even if it didn't, she's under my protection now. Your protection, Blackwood repeated, his tone mocking. How noble. Tell me, Miss Valenti, has he told you how we know each other? What kind of man you're trusting with your safety? Grace lifted her chin. Whatever history you share with Mr. Dawson, he's treated me with nothing but respect, which is more than can be said for a man who would sell another human being. Blackwood's eyes narrowed at her defiance. Spirited. I see why you're keeping her around, Dawson. He adjusted his gloves deliberately. Very well. I'll give you until the end of the month to reconsider. $5,000 or I'll take matters into my own hands. Is that a threat, Henry? Jack's hand rested casually near his gun. Consider it a business proposition. Blackwood turned his horse. 1 month, Dawson. Then we settle this the old way. With that ominous parting, he spurred his horse, his men following as they rode away from the ranch. Only when they were out of sight did Jack's shoulders relax slightly. Are you all right? He asked Grace, his eyes searching her face with concern. She nodded, though she was shaken by the encounter. What did he mean by the old way? A muscle worked in Jack's jaw. Nothing you need to worry about. I think I have a right to know, given that he came here because of me, Grace pressed, unwilling to be kept in the dark about her own situation. Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. Blackwood and I have history, bad blood. Years ago I worked for him briefly. You worked for that man. Grace couldn't hide her surprise. Not by choice, Jack said grimly. I owed him money, a debt of honor I couldn't escape. I worked it off, but what I saw while in his employ. He shook his head. Blackwood's enterprises aren't all legitimate. He runs protection rackets, smuggling operations, has his hands in everything from gambling to... He hesitated. To selling women, Grace guessed, feeling sick. Jack nodded once. When I'd paid my debt, I tried to expose some of his operations. It didn't go well. There was a confrontation. Men died. I left the territory for a while, and when I came back, I stayed clear of Redemption Creek and his businesses. Until I came along, Grace said softly, realization dawning. You didn't just happen to be in Redemption Creek when Blackwood's men came for me, did you? Jack's blue eyes met hers steadily. I heard rumors of what Blackwood was planning, that he'd acquired a young woman through a gambling debt and was planning to make an example of her. I didn't know it was you, but I couldn't stand by and let it happen. Grace absorbed this information, seeing Jack in a new light. He had deliberately put himself in danger for a stranger, risking reigniting an old feud. What will happen now? She asked quietly. Blackwood will try to pressure us, maybe threaten the ranch or the men. Jack's expression was grim but determined. But Judge Parker should arrive any day, and once we have legal protection for you, Blackwood will have to back down. Grace wasn't so sure. The look in Blackwood's eyes had been that of a man unaccustomed to losing and unwilling to start. And if the judge can't help, Jack's face softened slightly, then we'll find another way. I promise you, Grace, you won't be going anywhere you don't choose to go. The sincerity in his voice touched something deep within her, a place that had been walled off since her mother's death. For the first time in years, Grace felt protected, valued for herself rather than what use someone could make of her. "Thank you," she said simply, unable to express the full measure of her gratitude. Jack nodded once, then glanced toward the barn. "I need to finish the tack repairs. Would you let Miguel know about Blackwood's visit? He'll want to alert the men to keep watch." "Of course." Grace started toward the bunkhouse, then paused. "Jack, be careful. Blackwood seems like the type to hold grudges." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "So am I, when it comes to people I care about." The implications of those words followed Grace as she went to find Miguel. Was she now someone Jack Dawson cared about? And more troubling, why did the thought warm her heart when it should have frightened her? 2 days after Blackwood's visit, a dust cloud on the horizon announced new arrivals. Jack, who had been vigilant since the confrontation, rode out to meet the approaching wagon, returning with a distinguished-looking older man in a black suit and a younger man who appeared to be his clerk. "Judge Parker," Jack introduced them as they reached the house. "And his clerk, Mr. Collins. Gentlemen, this is Miss Grace Valenti." Judge Isaac Parker was in his 50s, with a well-trimmed beard and intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing as he greeted Grace courteously. "A pleasure, Miss Valenti. Jack has explained some of your situation in his letters. You've been corresponding about me?" Grace asked, surprised. "Since the day after you arrived," Jack confirmed. "I wanted the judge's advice on how to legally invalidate any claim Blackwood might make." They settled in the great room, where Grace served coffee while the judge questioned her about her father's debts, the circumstances of the gambling loss, and what she knew of the transaction that had supposedly made her Blackwood's property. "It's nonsense, of course," Judge Parker said firmly when she had finished. "No court in the territory would uphold such a claim. A man cannot gamble away another human being, even his own child, especially an adult daughter with her own legal standing." Relief flooded through Grace. "So legally, I'm free." "Absolutely," the judge confirmed. "However, men like Blackwood don't always respect legal boundaries." He turned to Jack. "I understand he's given you some sort of ultimatum." Jack nodded, filling the judge in on Blackwood's visit and demand for money. "He's given us a month, but I don't expect him to wait that long before trying something." Judge Parker stroked his beard thoughtfully. "I can issue a formal legal opinion declaring Miss Valenti free of any obligation related to her father's debts. It won't stop Blackwood if he's determined, but it will mean he can't claim any legal justification for his actions." "Do it," Jack said decisively. "And I'd like to formalize Grace's employment here as well. Proper contract, fair wages, everything legal and documented." Grace looked at him in surprise. "Is that necessary?" "It's protection," Jack explained. "If everything is official and witnessed by a federal judge, Blackwood will have a harder time claiming you're here against your will or under dubious circumstances." The wisdom of this precaution was evident, and Grace nodded her agreement. Mr. Collins was dispatched to draft the necessary documents, while Judge Parker accepted Jack's invitation to stay for dinner. As Grace prepared the meal, she could hear the men's voices from the great room, their discussion occasionally becoming heated as they moved from her situation to broader issues of law enforcement in the territory. "Blackwood's influence is growing," she heard the judge say. "The territorial governor is concerned, particularly about the reports of his operation at Red Canyon." "The governor should have been concerned years ago," Jack replied, his voice tight with suppressed anger. "I tried to tell them what was happening, but nobody would listen." "They're listening now," Judge Parker assured him. "Which brings me to another reason for my visit. The governor has authorized me to appoint special deputies to investigate Blackwood's operations, particularly the Red Canyon situation." There was a long pause before Jack spoke again, his voice lower. "You know I hung up my badge years ago, Isaac. I'm not asking you to take up a permanent position," the judge said reasonably. "Just a temporary commission, enough authority to investigate legally and protect Miss Valenti officially." Grace moved closer to the doorway, straining to hear Jack's response. "Blackwood has a small army of gunmen," Jack said finally. "Even with official backing, one man can't bring him down." "You wouldn't be alone," Judge Parker replied. "There are others working on this, marshals in position, building cases. Your role would be specific to the Red Canyon operation and Miss Valenti's protection." The conversation shifted again, lowering to murmurs she couldn't distinguish. Grace returned to her cooking, mind racing with this new information. Jack had been a lawman once, something he hadn't shared with her. And this Red Canyon that they kept mentioning, what was happening there that concerned the territorial governor. By the time dinner was ready, the men had reached some sort of agreement, though neither mentioned their discussion as they sat down to eat. The conversation over the meal focused instead on lighter topics: Judge Parker's family back east, developments in the territory, Jack's plans for expanding the ranch's breeding program. Later that evening, after the judge and his clerk had retired to the guest rooms, Grace found Jack sitting alone on the porch, staring out at the star-filled sky. She joined him, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders against the evening chill. "You were a lawman," she said softly, not a question but an invitation to explain. Jack glanced at her, then back at the stars. "Deputy U.S. Marshal for 3 years, mostly chasing outlaws through Indian territory, but I worked this region too. And that's how you knew Blackwood." He nodded slowly. "I was investigating rumors about his operations when I got into a card game I shouldn't have. Ended up owing him money I didn't have." His mouth twisted in a bitter smile. "He offered me a choice: work for him to pay it off, or face charges of welching on a debt." "That doesn't seem like much of a choice," Grace observed. "It wasn't." Jack's eyes were distant with memories. 6 months I worked as his security, watching him ruin lives, threaten people, worse. When I'd paid what I owed, I tried to bring him down legally, gathered evidence, witnesses." His hands tightened on the porch railing. "The night before I was to testify to the grand jury, Blackwood's men killed 2 of the witnesses. The third disappeared. The case fell apart." Grace's heart ached for the disillusionment she heard in his voice. "And now the judge wants you to try again." Jack turned to face her, his expression resolute in the moonlight. "Not just for the territory's sake. For yours. As a special deputy, I'd have more authority to protect you. If Blackwood tries anything, I can act legally." "Is it worth the risk?" Grace asked, genuinely concerned. "You have a good life here, a successful ranch. Some things matter more than cattle and land, Grace." His voice was quiet but firm. She studied his face, seeing beyond the tough exterior to the man beneath, a man with a strong moral code and the courage to stand by it, even at personal cost. Something shifted inside her, a recognition of qualities she had always valued but rarely found. "I don't want you putting yourself in danger because of me," she said finally. Jack's expression softened. "It's not just because of you. Blackwood has hurt too many people for too long. But you being here, that made the decision clearer." He hesitated, then added, "Having you here these past days, it's reminded me that some things are worth fighting for." The simple honesty in his words touched Grace deeply. Without thinking, she reached out and placed her hand over his on the railing. He looked down at their hands, then back at her face, something unspoken passing between them in the quiet night. "Whatever comes," Grace said softly, "we'll face it together." Jack turned his hand beneath hers, entwining their fingers in a gentle but unmistakable gesture of connection. They stayed that way for a long moment, the weight of unspoken feelings between them, before he reluctantly released her hand. "It's getting late," he said, his voice slightly rougher than usual. "We should get some rest. Tomorrow will be a busy day." Grace nodded, though she was reluctant to end this moment of closeness. "Good night, Jack." As she rose to go inside, he caught her hand once more. "Grace." He paused, seeming to struggle with words. "Thank you for understanding." She smiled, squeezing his hand gently before withdrawing to the house, her heart beating a little faster than usual. The next morning, Mr. Collins presented the completed documents for their signatures. Grace signed her employment contract, officially becoming the housekeeper of the Lazy D Ranch at a salary that seemed overly generous to her, but that Jack insisted was fair. Judge Parker then signed and sealed the legal opinion declaring that Grace had no obligation for her father's debts, and that any attempt to claim ownership or control over her person was illegal and unenforceable. "I'll file copies with the territorial court in Santa Fe," Judge Parker said, handing Grace her copy. "And I'll ensure that the sheriff in Redemption Creek receives official notice as well." Jack nodded approvingly. "And my deputy commission." The judge produced another document from his case. "Effective immediately. It grants you the authority to investigate Blackwood's operations, particularly regarding the Red Canyon situation, and to protect Miss Valenti from any attempts to coerce or kidnap her." Grace watched as Jack pinned the deputy's badge to his vest, noting how natural it looked there, as if returning to its rightful place. "What happens now?" she asked. "The judge and Mr. Collins continue their circuit," Jack explained. "I start gathering information on Blackwood's current operations, particularly Red Canyon, and we remain vigilant here." "What is Red Canyon?" Grace asked, the question that had been burning in her mind since overhearing their conversation. "You both keep mentioning it." The men exchanged glances before Judge Parker answered. "Red Canyon is a remote area about 20 miles east of here. We've received reports that Blackwood has established some sort of operation there, possibly mining, possibly something else. There are rumors of forced labor, women held against their will." "Like what he planned for me," Grace said, understanding dawning. Jack nodded grimly. "If we can confirm what's happening there, we can bring federal charges against him, serious ones that even his money and connections can't make disappear." The judge and his clerk departed after lunch, promising to return within a month. Jack spent the afternoon meeting with Miguel and the other hands, explaining the situation and the potential threat from Blackwood. "We'll double the watches," Miguel said firmly. "No one comes onto this ranch without us knowing." "Good," Jack approved. "And I want one man with Grace at all times if she needs to go anywhere beyond the immediate yard." "Jack, is that really necessary?" Grace protested. "I don't need a constant guardian." His expression was unyielding. "Until Blackwood is dealt with, yes, it is necessary. I'm not taking chances with your safety." Though she chafed at the restriction, Grace understood his concern. Blackwood had made his intentions clear, and she had no doubt he would follow through on his threats if given the opportunity. In the days that followed, Jack divided his time between ranch work and his investigations. Twice he rode to Winston to send telegrams and gather information, returning with supplies and news from the outside world. Grace settled deeper into her role, taking pride in keeping the house immaculate and preparing meals that brought appreciative comments from Jack and the hands alike. Despite the shadow of Blackwood's threat, or perhaps because of it, Grace found herself growing closer to Jack. Their evenings on the porch became a cherished ritual, a time for conversation and companionable silence beneath the vast star-filled sky. She learned that he enjoyed poetry and could recite Tennyson from memory. He discovered her passion for botany and her dream of someday having a greenhouse filled with exotic plants. 2 weeks after the judge's departure, Jack announced at breakfast that he needed to ride to a place called Miner's Rest, a small settlement near Red Canyon. "I have a contact there who might have information about Blackwood's operation," he explained. "I'll be gone overnight." Grace felt an immediate stab of anxiety. "Is it safe for you to go alone?" "Safer than with company," Jack said. "I'm less conspicuous that way. Miguel will be in charge while I'm gone, and Hank will stay near the house." Though she wanted to protest, Grace recognized the determination in his expression. This was part of his duty now, both to the law and to her protection. "Just be careful," she said finally. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Always am." Jack departed shortly after, riding east toward the distant mountains. Grace tried to keep busy with her usual tasks, but worry nagged at her throughout the day. By evening, she found herself sitting on the porch, staring in the direction he had gone, as if her gaze could somehow protect him across the miles. "He will be fine, señorita," Miguel said kindly, bringing her a cup of coffee. "Señor Jack, he knows how to take care of himself." "I know," Grace sighed. "I just can't help worrying." Miguel studied her face with knowing eyes. "You care for him." It wasn't a question, and Grace didn't deny it. "Is it that obvious?" the foreman smiled. "Only to those with eyes. And perhaps to Señor Jack himself, though he is sometimes slow to see what is before him." Grace felt her cheeks warm. "I don't know what he feels." "Don't you?" Miguel's expression was gentle. "The way he looks at you when he thinks no one is watching." I have not seen such a look in his eyes since before the trouble with Blackwood. Before Grace could respond to this intriguing statement, the sound of approaching riders interrupted them. Miguel instantly tensed, his hand moving to the revolver at his hip. "Stay in the house, señorita," he ordered, moving to the edge of the porch for a better view. Grace retreated to the doorway but didn't go inside, watching as 3 riders emerged from the gathering dusk. Relief flooded through her as she recognized Jack's tall figure on his chestnut stallion, but it quickly turned to alarm when she realized he was slumped forward in the saddle, supported by the 2 men flanking him. "Miguel," she cried. "It's Jack, he's hurt." The foreman was already running toward the riders, Grace close behind him despite his instructions to stay back. As they reached the group, she saw that Jack was conscious but pale, his shirt stained with blood along his left side. "Ambushed," he managed through gritted teeth as Miguel and one of the strangers helped him from the saddle. "These men found me on the trail." "Get him inside," Grace directed, pushing aside her fear to focus on practical matters. "Miguel, I'll need hot water, bandages from the medicine cabinet." Quickly. Between them, they got Jack into the house and onto the sofa in the great room. Grace immediately began cutting away his bloodied shirt to reveal a deep gash along his ribs. "Knife wound," one of the strangers said, a weathered man in his 40s with a marshal's badge pinned to his vest. "He's lucky. Couple inches deeper would have been his lung." "Who are you?" Grace asked, pressing a clean cloth to the wound to slow the bleeding. "Marshal Tom Harker, madam. This is my deputy, Will Simmons. We've been working the Blackwood case from the federal side." Jack grimaced as Grace cleaned the wound. "They were at Miner's Rest gathering information too. Saved my hide when Blackwood's men jumped me." "How many were there?" Miguel asked, returning with the medical supplies Grace had requested. 3, Jack said. "They knew I was coming." "Someone must have tipped them off." The marshal nodded grimly. "Blackwood has eyes and ears everywhere, but we got something worth the trouble." He pulled a folded paper from his vest. "Map of the Red Canyon operation, complete with guard positions and where they're keeping the workers." Grace threaded a needle with steady hands. "This is going to hurt," she warned Jack. "The cut's deep and needs stitching." He nodded, bracing himself. "Do what you have to do." With careful precision, Grace began sewing the edges of the wound together. Jack remained stoically silent, though she could feel the tension in his muscles each time the needle pierced his skin. When she finally tied off the last stitch and bandaged the wound, his face was sheened with sweat, but his eyes were clear. "Thank you," he said softly. Grace allowed herself to stroke his forehead once, brushing back a lock of damp hair. "You're welcome, but no more heroics, please." "Can't promise that," he replied, the ghost of a smile touching his lips despite the pain. "Not with what we found out." The marshal spread the map on the table as Miguel brought coffee for everyone. "Red Canyon's worse than we thought," he explained. "It's not just a mine, it's a forced labor camp. Blackwood's been grabbing drifters, Mexican workers, even a few Chinese from the railroad. Works them until they drop, mining silver from a vein he found." "And the women?" Grace asked, remembering the judge's mention of women being held there. The marshal's expression darkened. "That's the worst of it. He's got a dozen or more kept in a separate compound. Some he sells, others." He glanced at Grace apologetically. "I understand," she said quietly, sickened but not surprised by Blackwood's depravity. Jack pushed himself to a sitting position, wincing with the effort. "The good news is we now have enough evidence for a federal raid. Marshal Harker has men positioned in Winston and Redemption Creek, ready to move." "When?" Miguel asked. 3 days, the marshal replied. "We're gathering a force of 20 men, deputies, territorial rangers, a few army scouts. We hit the canyon at dawn, free the workers, arrest everyone involved." "I'll be there," Jack said firmly. Grace shot him an incredulous look. "You're injured." "I'll be healed enough by then," he insisted. "This is what I've been working toward for years, Grace. I have to see it through." She wanted to argue, to forbid him from putting himself in further danger, but she recognized the resolve in his eyes. This wasn't just about upholding the law. It was personal redemption for his failure to stop Blackwood years ago. "Then I'm coming too," she declared, surprising everyone including herself. "Absolutely not," Jack said flatly. "It's too dangerous." "I'll stay with the supply wagons," Grace countered. "Those women will need help, medical attention, decent clothing, food. You can't ask me to sit here safely while you risk your life again." "She has a point, Dawson," Marshal Harker said unexpectedly. "We'll have women who have been through hell. Having a female presence might help them feel safer." Jack looked from the marshal to Grace, conflict evident in his expression. "You stay with the wagons," he said finally. "Nowhere near the fighting, and you follow orders without question." "Agreed, agreed," Grace said, relief mingling with trepidation at the thought of what lay ahead. The next 2 days passed in a flurry of preparation. The marshal and his deputy returned to Winston to coordinate with the other law enforcement officers, while Jack recovered with remarkable speed, though Grace could tell he was in more pain than he admitted. On the morning of the 3rd day, they rode out before dawn, Jack, Grace, Miguel, and Hank, leaving only Pedro to watch the ranch. They met the marshal's force at a predetermined location about 5 miles from Red Canyon, where nearly 24 grim-faced men were making final preparations. Grace was directed to a supply wagon where she would wait with the army doctor until the fighting was over. "Stay here until we send for you," Jack instructed her, his expression serious beneath his hat brim. "No matter what you hear." Grace nodded, fear tightening her throat as she realized the danger he was riding into. "Jack, Before she could finish, he stepped closer, one hand coming up to cup her cheek. "I know," he said softly. Then, in a move that surprised her completely, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a brief but tender kiss. "For luck," he murmured as he pulled away, leaving Grace momentarily speechless. She watched as he mounted and rode to join the marshal at the head of the column. The men moved out in silence, disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness toward Red Canyon. The waiting was agonizing. Grace tried to help the doctor organize medical supplies, but her mind kept returning to Jack, to that unexpected kiss, to the danger he faced. The sound of distant gunfire started about an hour after the men left, sporadic at first, then intensifying. She clenched her hands, fighting the urge to run toward the sounds, knowing she had promised to stay put. It was nearly noon when a rider appeared, galloping toward their position. "Doc." "Miss, they need you at the canyon. It's over, we've taken the place." The doctor immediately began loading his supplies into a smaller wagon that could navigate the rough terrain into the canyon. Grace helped him, her heart pounding with a mixture of relief and fear. Jack was alive, he must be, or the rider would have said something, but what about the others? What condition would they find the captives in? The ride into Red Canyon revealed a scene of organized chaos. The mining operation was substantial, with wooden structures built into the red rock walls, ore carts on rails, and a large processing area. Marshal Harker's men had rounded up about 30 of Blackwood's guards and overseers, disarmed them, and confined them under heavy watch. The freed laborers, gaunt men of various ethnicities, were being given food and water while their injuries were assessed. Grace spotted Jack directing operations near what appeared to be administrative buildings. Relief flooded through her at the sight of him, upright and apparently unharmed, though he moved carefully, favoring his injured side. He saw her wagon arriving and came over, his face grim despite the success of the raid. "We found the women's compound," he said without preamble. "It's bad, Grace. They've been mistreated, starved. Some look like they haven't seen daylight in months." "Where are they?" she asked, already climbing down from the wagon. "This way." Jack led her to a separate area where female captives were being cared for by the marshal's wife, and several other women from Winston, who had arrived to help. Grace's heart broke at the sight of the thin, traumatized women, many bearing bruises and other signs of abuse. She immediately set to work, helping distribute clean clothing, assisting the doctor with examinations, and simply sitting with those too shocked to speak. Many were Mexican or Native American, though there were a few white women as well, including one who couldn't have been more than 17. "Blackwood's operation was bigger than we realized," Jack told her during a brief break. "He was using the mine as cover for multiple illegal activities: smuggling, forced labor, even a counterfeiting operation we found hidden in one of the caves." "And Blackwood himself?" Grace asked. Jack's expression darkened. "Not here, but we found his ledgers, records of everything, including the names of officials he's been bribing. It's enough to destroy him, even if he escapes justice personally." The work of caring for the freed captives and processing the prisoners continued through the day and into the night. Grace worked until exhaustion forced her to rest, finding a quiet corner in one of the buildings where she could close her eyes briefly. She was awakened by Jack gently shaking her shoulder. "Grace, wake up, we have a situation." She blinked up at him, instantly alert at the urgency in his voice. "What is it, Blackwood?" Jack said tersely. "He's been spotted riding toward the ranch with 6 men. Miguel just got word from Pedro." Fear shot through her. Why would he go there? "There's nothing of value, revenge," Jack cut her off. "He knows we've taken his operation and he's lost everything. He's striking at what he thinks I value most." The implication wasn't lost on Grace. Blackwood was targeting the ranch because it was Jack's home and possibly because he suspected Jack's feelings for her might lead him to look for her there. "We need to go," she said, rising immediately. Jack nodded grimly. "Marshal Harker's giving us 6 men. We ride in 10 minutes." The journey back to the Lazy D was tense, the riders pushing their horses as hard as they dared in the darkness. Dawn was breaking as they approached the ranch, and Grace's heart sank at the sight of smoke rising from the direction of the bunkhouse. "He's burning us out," Jack said, his voice tight with anger. They crested the final hill to find the bunkhouse indeed ablaze, though the main house still stood intact. In the yard between stood Henry Blackwood and his remaining loyal gunmen, facing off against Pedro, who had taken cover behind a water trough. Jack signaled for the marshal's men to spread out, keeping Grace behind him as they rode down the hill. Blackwood's head snapped up at their approach, his face contorting with fury when he recognized Jack. "Dawson," he shouted, "you've destroyed everything I built." "You destroyed yourself, Henry," Jack called back, reining in his horse at a safe distance. "It's over. The mine is shut down, your men arrested, your captives freed. Surrender now and you'll get a fair trial." Blackwood laughed bitterly. "A trial? We both know I'll hang if I'm taken alive." His cold gaze shifted to Grace. "So this is what it was all about, not justice a woman. You threw away our history for a pretty face." "Put down your weapons," Jack said firmly, ignoring the taunt. "There's nowhere left to run." For a moment it seemed Blackwood might comply. Then, with shocking speed, he drew his pistol and fired not at Jack but at Grace. Jack moved instantly, pushing her from her horse as the bullet whistled past where she had been sitting. As she fell, Grace saw Jack drawing his own weapon, heard the thunderous exchange of gunfire that followed. She hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from her lungs. By the time she could push herself up, the shooting had stopped. The air was thick with gunsmoke and several bodies lay motionless in the yard. Jack was on one knee, his gun still trained on Blackwood, who was on the ground clutching his shoulder, his face twisted in pain and rage. "It's over, Henry," Jack said, his voice weary but firm. "You've lost." Marshal Harker's men moved in to disarm and secure Blackwood and his surviving men. Grace ran to Jack, who had risen to his feet but was swaying slightly. "Are you hurt?" she demanded, scanning him for new injuries. He shook his head. "Just reopened the old one, I think." His hand pressed against his side where a fresh stain of blood was spreading. "Are you all right? When he fired at you, I'm fine," she assured him. "Thanks to you." The marshal joined them, looking grimly satisfied. "Blackwood will hang for this attempted murder on top of everything else we found at the canyon. His empire's finished." Jack nodded, the tension gradually leaving his shoulders as the reality of their victory sank in. "Good. It's been a long time coming." In the days that followed, order was gradually restored. The bunkhouse had been damaged but not destroyed, and repairs began immediately. Blackwood and his men were taken to Santa Fe to await trial, while those rescued from Red Canyon were provided care and assistance in returning to their homes or starting new lives. Judge Parker returned as promised, bringing news that the territorial governor was personally overseeing the Blackwood case due to its magnitude and the political ramifications of the corrupt officials named in his ledgers. "You've done the territory a great service," the judge told Jack as they sat on the porch a week after the raid. The governor mentioned a possible commendation. Jack shook his head. "I don't need recognition. Seeing Blackwood face justice is enough." The judge studied him thoughtfully. "Will you keep the deputy's badge? There's a permanent position available if you want it." Grace, who had been bringing coffee to the men, paused at this question, her heart suddenly anxious. Would Jack return to his former life as a lawman, leaving the ranch and her behind? Jack seemed to sense her concern, his eyes meeting hers briefly before he answered. "No, thank you, Isaac. My place is here now. I have everything I need right here." The warmth in his gaze as he looked at Grace left little doubt about his meaning. Judge Parker smiled knowingly and changed the subject, but Grace felt a spark of hope kindling in her chest. That evening, after the judge had retired, Jack found Grace sitting on the porch swing, watching the stars emerge in the deepening twilight. He joined her, wincing slightly as he sat. His wound was healing well but still tender. "The ranch is quiet again," Grace observed. "Almost hard to believe everything that's happened." Jack agreed. "Peace feels strange after so much chaos." They sat in comfortable silence for a while before Jack cleared his throat. "Grace, I've been meaning to talk to you about your position here." Her heart skipped a beat. Was he going to suggest she move on now that the danger was past? "Yes. Your contract was for housekeeping duties," he began carefully. "But I was wondering if you might consider a different arrangement." Grace looked at him, confused. "What sort of arrangement?" Jack took a deep breath, then took her hand in his. "A permanent one as my wife." The directness of the proposal startled her, though not as much as the surge of joy she felt at his words. "Jack, I know it's sudden," he hurried on, "and you may not feel the same way, but these weeks with you, despite all the danger and difficulties, they've been the happiest I've known in years." His blue eyes were earnest as they met hers. "I love you, Grace, not just for your cooking or how you've made this house a home again. I love your courage, your kindness, your strength." Grace felt tears stinging her eyes. "When my father gambled me away, I thought my life was over," she said softly. "I never imagined it was just beginning." She squeezed his hand. "I love you too, Jack, and yes, I would be honored to be your wife." The smile that transformed his face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, radiant and full of promise. He drew her into his arms with gentle reverence, kissing her with a tenderness that spoke of all the love he'd held back until now. "You know," he murmured against her hair when they finally broke apart, "when I first saw Blackwood's men trying to take you away, I acted on instinct. It was only later I realized." "Realized what?" Grace prompted when he hesitated. "That you weren't just someone who needed saving," Jack said, his voice low and sincere. "When Blackwood said you were being sold as a lesson, all I could think was that you were a blessing instead, the best thing that could have happened to me." Grace smiled, touched by his words. "From a debt to a blessing, it's quite a transformation." "No transformation needed," Jack corrected her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You were always a blessing. I just had the good fortune to recognize it." They were married 3 weeks later, with Judge Parker performing the ceremony on the porch of what was now their home. Miguel and Alina stood as witnesses, along with the ranch hands and several of the people they had helped rescue from Red Canyon who had chosen to stay in the area. As they exchanged their vows beneath an arch of wildflowers Grace had gathered, she reflected on the strange twists of fate that had brought her here. Her father's recklessness, which had seemed like a curse, had ultimately led her to this moment, to this man who looked at her with such love in his eyes as he promised to cherish her all the days of his life. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Judge Parker declared with evident satisfaction. "You may kiss your bride, Jack." As Jack's lips met hers, sealing their union, Grace felt the last shadows of her past dissolve in the warmth of their shared future. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, their love a fortress stronger than any Blackwood had ever built. The celebration continued well into the evening, with music and dancing in the yard beneath lanterns strung from the trees. As the night deepened, Jack led Grace away from the festivities toward the house that had become their sanctuary. "Happy, Mrs. Dawson?" he asked, his arm around her waist. Grace leaned into his embrace, her heart full to overflowing. "More than I ever thought possible." Jack stopped at the porch steps, turning to face her, his expression suddenly serious. "I want you to know something, Grace. What happened with Blackwood, you being brought into my life this way, it wasn't luck or coincidence." "What do you mean?" she asked, curious. "I mean that sometimes the worst moments in our lives lead us to the best," he said, cupping her face gently. "Your father's mistake brought you to me. My failures with Blackwood prepared me to protect you. It's like all the broken pieces of our pasts were meant to fit together to make something whole." Grace felt tears stinging her eyes at the simple poetry of his words. "For a tough cowboy, you have quite a way with words, Jack Dawson." He smiled, a flash of white teeth in the moonlight. "Only with you. You bring out the best in me." As they walked into their home together, Grace knew that whatever the future held, they had already overcome the worst that life could throw at them. From the ashes of Blackwood's cruel intentions had risen something he could never understand or destroy, a love forged in adversity, tempered by courage, and sealed with the promise of forever. 5 years later, Grace stood on the porch of the expanded ranch house, watching Jack teaching their 4-year-old son to ride his first pony in the corral. Little Thomas had his father's blue eyes and his mother's dark hair, and showed every sign of becoming as skilled a horseman as Jack himself. Their 2-year-old daughter, Maria, named after Grace's mother, sat at Grace's feet, contentedly playing with wooden animals Jack had carved for her. Grace rested a hand on her swelling belly, feeling the gentle kicks of their third child, due in the late summer. The Lazy D had prospered beyond Jack's most ambitious hopes. The herd had grown to over 1,000 head, the land holdings expanded to include the fertile valley to the north, and they now employed a dozen full-time hands. The greenhouse Jack had built for Grace's birthday 3 years ago flourished with both practical herbs and the exotic specimens she had always dreamed of cultivating. Henry Blackwood's legacy, by contrast, had crumbled to dust. He had been convicted on multiple counts of kidnapping, forced labor, and attempted murder, and had died in prison the previous winter. His properties had been auctioned off, much of the proceeds going to compensate his victims. Miguel and Alina had built a proper house on the ranch property, and now oversaw much of the daily operations, allowing Jack more time with his growing family. Pedro had married a young woman rescued from Red Canyon and started his own small spread nearby. The territory was changing rapidly, with statehood on the horizon and the wild frontier gradually yielding to civilization. "Mama, look," Thomas called, his face alight with pride as he guided his pony in a small circle without Jack's hand on the lead rope. "Well done, sweetheart." Grace called back, her heart swelling with love for her little family. Jack looked up at her, his smile as warm as the day they had married. Though time had added a few streaks of silver to his hair at the temples and deepened the laugh lines around his eyes, he was still the most handsome man Grace had ever known. Later that evening, after the children were asleep, Jack and Grace sat together on the porch swing that had become their favorite spot for quiet conversation at day's end. "I had a letter from Judge Parker today," Jack said, his arm comfortably around her shoulders. "He's retiring next year. Wants us to come to Santa Fe for the celebration." Grace nodded against his shoulder. "We should go. We owe him so much." Jack agreed. "Though I think we've repaid any debt. His granddaughter still talks about the summer you taught her botany when she visited." Grace smiled at the memory of the bright-eyed girl who had followed her around the greenhouse, eagerly learning the names and properties of each plant. "She has a natural gift. I wouldn't be surprised if she becomes a doctor someday." They sat in companionable silence, watching the fireflies begin their evening dance over the meadow. Finally, Jack spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "You ever think about how differently things might have turned out? If your father hadn't lost that card game, if I hadn't been in Redemption Creek that day?" Grace considered the question. "Sometimes. But then I look at our children, our home, everything we've built together, and I can only be grateful for how things did turn out." She turned her face up to his. "Besides, I think we would have found each other somehow. Some things are just meant to be." Jack's eyes softened as he gazed down at her, still filled with the same wonder as when he had first proposed on this very porch. "You know, that day when I told Blackwood's men you were under my protection, I had no idea I was really protecting my own future happiness." "Your blessing instead of a lesson," Grace quoted softly. "The greatest blessing of my life," Jack amended, bending to kiss her with the same tenderness that never failed to make her heart race, even after all these years. As the stars emerged overhead and the ranch settled into nighttime quiet, Grace Dawson reflected on the long, winding trail that had led her here from desperate fear to perfect contentment, from being treated as property to being cherished as a partner and lover. The journey had been difficult at times, dangerous at others, but every step had been necessary to reach this moment of perfect peace. In Jack's arms, beneath the vast western sky that had witnessed their love story unfold, Grace gave thanks for second chances, unexpected journeys, and the remarkable truth that sometimes the darkest moments of our lives can lead us directly to our brightest futures if only we have the courage to follow where they lead.